Later on today, the David Jones Showcase. This is one of the first, amongst the first that we've had. One earlier last year, also in Melbourne. So a chance to showcase New Zealand brands in one place in what is a very significant retailer. And again, events this evening as well. So look, happy to take questions.
What do you make of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese singling out the flood relief for Kiwis that are being affected by the weather events here?
It's a significant shift to see that flood-affected Kiwis will now have the same access to flood relief that we see Australians will. And for me, this is recognition of the fact that New Zealanders are Australia's best migrants in terms of the contribution they make here. It's only right that they get the same access for support, and it's so pleasing to see the Prime Minister recognise that.
What do you think it signals going into your meeting on Friday, when you've already indicated you do plan on raising the rights of New Zealanders living here in Australia?
We've consistently raised the issue of New Zealanders' rights here in Australia, and consistently made the point that New Zealand are Australia's best migrants in terms of the contribution that they make to the tax take here and the economy. So I see this as progress. I see it as a recognition of that contribution, and we'll be working to continue to see progress. It will take some time, we recognise that, but this is emblematic, I think, of the step change we're seeing in the relationship.
Have you been in touch with Mr Albanese? Do you know how many Kiwis will be affected by this policy change?
This is something that I'll likely touch base with him on when I see him on Friday. For that particular information, we know there are 150,000 New Zealanders in New South Wales. For those specifically within the flood-affected area, I couldn't tell you, but regardless of the size, I think knowing that whomever is affected, you're seeing equitable treatment, means that New Zealanders can see that they are, through this Act, that they are increasingly recognised and valued.
We probably wouldn't have seen this under a Morrison government.
No, in fact, we did explicitly see the opposite.
Yeah, so what does this say about the relationship going forward? Is this pretty much a green light for you?
Yeah, this for me is a sign of progress. It's a sign that there is recognition of the contribution that New Zealanders have long made to Australia. And now we need to continue that progress. It's a sign, I hope, of the relationship experiencing that, that reset that we had hoped for.
On tourism, when you were talking about New Zealand and Australia being a destination together for long-haul travellers, you suggested the need for a level playing field in terms of regulations across countries. What do you mean by that?
Specifically here for our aviation companies. So here you see the likes of Air New Zealand working collaboratively with Singapore Airline on the issue of reducing carbon emissions for their businesses, and particularly looking at issues like biofuels and how we can collaborate. I think overall, when we think about the aviation industry, very difficult area for them to make progress on emissions, but we need them to. Increasingly, consumers will want to feel good about their travel, and they'll want to know that where they are having an impact, that they're able to offset it or reduce it as much as possible. But if you have only one airline making a move on that, then unfortunately they potentially may see themselves as losing competitive advantage from a price point. So how do we make sure that we lift all of the boats so that we don't see a race to the bottom that's bad for people and planet, but we see a level of standard for emissions reduction? So Singapore Airlines, Air New Zealand already working together. Qantas have also indicated they're interested in this area. So let's have that discussion as industries.
How can we be sure that that won't hike prices too much? It's already expensive to come to this part of the world.
And yet people are doing it. I mean, we're expecting 75% uptake in terms of capacity on those trans-Tasman routes. Anyone who's tried to book will have seen there's a lot of demand. And so this is about making sure that where we have the potential to increase that demand, people aren't put off by the idea that they think they're leaving an emissions profile or increasing to the footprint that comes with travel. We've got to give them that ability to offset or to mitigate.
Domestically, there were more than 10,000 COVID cases in New Zealand today, and an increased number in hospitalisations. Are you concerned about this? Are you thinking about lifting restrictions? Increasing restrictions in any way?
As I said yesterday, the advice that we have from our officials is that the most meaningful thing that we can do to continue to have an impact on COVID cases boosters, vaccinations, and mask use. You'll keep in mind that any increase in settings, such as a move to red, what that does is reimpose gathering limits. Where we're seeing increases in cases at the moment, the view seems to be that actually those restrictions would not necessarily reduce the cases we have. Masks do, vaccines do. A reminder to Kiwis, if you are an older New Zealander in the 50-plus range, please go and get that 4th dose. We know that we have transmission amongst our older New Zealanders. That's why we're seeing those hospitalisations lift, because of the impact COVID does have on those who are more vulnerable. The final point to make is that you see in Waitemata was responsible for a reasonable part of that lift. That's because of a particular issue that we have there with COVID infection and transmission, but that's one of the contributing factors.
What's that issue?
COVID cases within the hospital, as I understand it.
And what's your latest official advice on new variants and the role that they're playing in the rising numbers in New Zealand?
Look, you can see internationally the impact that B4 and B5 is having. And so in Europe, where I've just travelled from, 30% increase being reported in Europe and in the UK, quite dramatically. Now, new waves are not unexpected. New Zealand has prepared for this. It is fair to say it is taking its toll because of the impact it's also having on our workforce. So here I want to acknowledge that in particular our health workforce, they're not only dealing with increased admissions into hospital, they themselves are experiencing illness, and that means that we have absences and others are having to pick up extra work and extra shifts. Thank you for the work that you are doing. Now the rest of us need to show our solidarity with our health workers by making sure we're doing our bit. Please get vaccinated with your most up-to-date booster, and please use your mask.
If you think about when you were in the US, you arrived and there was that mass school shooting, really obviously horrific, and then very different local disaster situation here, but you arrived and there's flooding and evacuations. How do these domestic local disasters impact?
I thought you were about to blame me for the fact that they were coinciding with my visits. Thank you for not going there.
Change the trajectory. You're happy to say that if you want.
No. How does it change the trajectory or alter the visits or the...
Yeah, and what you might talk to, will it have any impact on your meeting?
There is no question that whatever is going on domestically will often be on the minds of the leaders that you're meeting with. But in the cases and the examples that you've given of, for instance, gun laws and gun law reforms in the United States or severe weather events here in Australia, it often just underscores the areas where we're looking to share ideas and strengthen our collective response to the issues we're experiencing. Climate change is having a huge impact on our region. Australia has been experiencing it at a significant degree over the past few months, and this is an area where both Prime Minister Albanese and myself are very keen to work together.
Back to sustainable aviation.
Yep.
Is there potential, and if there is there any discussion occurring between the Australian and New Zealand governments about perhaps mandating proportions of biofuels?
We've discussed in broad terms, if I recall correctly, we've discussed in broad terms transport and emissions issues. I've certainly discussed with Qantas, the CEO I had a meeting with relatively recently. Obviously, I've had this discussion with Air New Zealand and Singapore Airlines. You know, in my mind, moving collectively in this space makes sense for our region. We're not there yet, but you see New Zealand working very hard to make progress on biofuels, and I think it's a good conversation to have.
Just looking ahead to the...
And then, Luke, did you have anything? Because then I'll wrap after that.
Just looking ahead to the ANZ Alley tomorrow night. It's the first time in a few years since the pandemic began that government and business leaders across the Tasman have got together. What are your thoughts going into that evening and the scope that the New Zealand and Australian business communities have now that there's a change of government in Australia?
Yeah. And here, you can see from the business delegation here, the areas that they're looking to focus on. Sustainability is a significant piece of their focus as they go into export into new markets, and naturally, therefore, it should be a significant piece of our focus as governments. Equally, then, there's the things that we can do just to make business easier for them. What can we do together to resolve supply chain constraints that our businesses will be facing? What's the next steps beyond e-invoicing to remove friction at the border? We're already pretty seamless. What more can we do together? And then you see sector by sector some specific initiatives like those flows in tourism. But this is actually the opportunity for us together to hear from business across New Zealand and Australia about the areas where they believe that we can create an ease of flow between two countries that are already well known for the ease of doing business. And then,
were you expecting that if there was to be any flood relief that New Zealanders would be included, or has that come as a bit of a surprise today?
it would always be my expectation that New Zealanders would have the same access
But given that
relief.
they hadn't, and that it's a change.
I think probably what stood out to me more was the fact that they didn't. So this for me feels like a natural return to a policy now grounded in fairness. What happened before was unfair, grossly unfair.
Do you think it's a result of continued representations by your government over several years, and then the fact that there has been a change in administrations here?
I think it fundamentally represents a government that takes a different view to Kiwis in Australia and the contribution they make. I do. Yeah.
A couple of questions from a colleague, sorry. Ngāi Tahu's tourism arm is promising to become carbon neutral by 2050. What does our tourism carbon footprint look like at the moment in comparison to other sectors?
You know, what has really stood out to me is the tourism industry has had an incredibly tough 2 years. But in those 2 years, you've seen a real focus and energy around making sure that as we emerge, we come back better. And that focus is on furthering our sustainability credentials and making our tourists, when they come to New Zealand, feel good about the fact that they've visited a place where they leave no trace and in fact leave it better. Thank you. Explicitly see the opposite.
Yeah, so what does this say about the relationship going forward? Is this pretty much a green light for you?
Yeah, this for me is a sign of progress. It's a sign that there is recognition of the contribution that New Zealanders have long made to Australia. And now we need to continue that progress.